would definitely be a lot easier to make these videos if I could just put this camera somewhere and then not have to think about it. So let's see. Just thinking about information. Thinking about information because I've realized that it's become almost impossible for me to exist comfortably, is all. Of course I can exist, but to exist comfortably in the world, really. But in the internet in particular, because it just seems to me that people use information still primarily as a weapon. I just see people abusing information and abusing each other with information, and also really failing to understand the way that information works when it comes to very large pools of it. A metaphor that comes to mind is like this. People learned how to deal with a puddle of information. The way that you deal with a puddle is you put on some rain boots, and this is a weird metaphor because what is anybody doing anything with a puddle, so I don't know. But to make the metaphor work, what you're doing with this particular puddle, because it's an information puddle, is what does this information mean to me? How am I going to interpret it? And if it's a puddle, like I said, you get dressed for the job, you go out there and you maybe have, I don't know, some buckets. And so you just start sifting through. You do your little game with it, and then that works. You've digested that information. But now what's happening is that we have things that aren't puddles. They're really giant oceans of information. And if you go in with your boots and your little cups, your little measuring cups, you're not going to make sense of that information. In fact, you're going to drown in that information. And I want to mix my metaphor now and say that if we consider the upper layers of this thing to be like ego-conscious information, and the lower levels of it, the ocean now I'm talking about, to recess into the collective unconscious, then you have a really, really good picture of what's happening right now. There are people who get lost in a big data vortex. And once they're in that vortex, it's connected to the deeper layers of mind. And then they sink into those deeper layers of mind, potentially. And then something shamanic is happening, and they don't know what's happening. This is what happened to Randy's case. I'd also know this person as Andrew Blaze. Most people don't know this person. This was an obscure shooter. The media didn't report on it very much. But this was a person who was an artist, actually, and a video artist, and someone who accidentally entered a kind of Jungian active imagination process in which he began dialoguing with figures representing, in this case, mostly representing aspects of Randy's anima, I would say. And, well, it just took a very bad turn, that one. This particular person did not manage to put the pieces back together into an integrated shape. Instead, they ended up killing a number of people and then killing themselves. And I mention it, one, because it's something I've wanted to talk about on the channel for a while, but it's one of those things I just couldn't find the right energy for. It's quite a heavy topic, I think. Because this was, I don't think anybody likes to see people who are somewhat similar to themselves flip, because you're like, oh gosh, it means that nobody's safe from this kind of loneliness, isolation, pathogen. That then when you then combine that with this new data ecology that we're existent in. Gosh, this phone has a weird habit of cutting out in useful places. What was I trying to say? I said I wanted to begin with a simple observation about the way that people use information today. Often use information. Two people are interacting online and they come to a disagreement about something. Here's my... It's probably not necessary to show these stupid little drawings. This helps me think to make these little drawings. It gets the right hemisphere involved. he says as he points to his left hemisphere, involved, which often yields different sorts of insights. So, well, let's cut right to the chase with the situation that I think is, which I think is developing in a very bad way in the country, that I think is going to pop eventually. Let's talk about the kinds of things you see on incel forums. I spent some time first of all, I monitor these forums periodically. I have to be really careful about how much time I spend in these sorts of areas of the internet. There are multiple communities that I observe with a slightly paranoid mindset or something, you know? And if I let myself, I could easily spend all day, every day, just like immersed in that data, doing my weird data tentacle thing with it, trying to figure out, okay, where is this going? What's the psychology behind it? How is this all going to, you know, I start to think, oh gosh, what if this community found this community? And they start talking. And then what if they, you know, I start to visualize like a little bit of like the time, like ways that these groups could combine into bigger groups and things like this. And I get very, very nervous about some of these things. And I think that my nervousness about them is in fact ultimately fairly proportional to the seriousness of the threats here. And I don't mean to say that incels in and of themselves are threats. It's not the direction I'm going with this. I think there are individuals who are threatening within that community, but there are such individuals in most communities. This is something we're going to learn about communities as we observe them evolve on the internet, where we have these very rich, detailed histories of like how these groups changed over time. And eventually we're going to really, really learn some stuff about human group dynamics and interesting things of that sort. But anyway, you know, once the nets get a hold of them. So they have a disagreement. The disagreement in this case, because we're going to talk about an incel forum, is going to be that, well, actually, it's so beautifully symmetrical. So I was about to say, sorry, I get lost in the ideas sometimes. That, of course, is all in the context of me trying to explain why I'm on incel forums sometimes, and why I can't spend very much time on them, in fact, because I am very empathic and I absorb the emotional situation in these places. And wow, so these places, there's just so much pain, mainly. To me, it's not even really about the anger and the, you know, that I have good sort of circle maneuvers for that stuff. I don't let that kind of stuff affect me so much. But the raw suffering that's behind all that stuff, it actually takes a lot out of me. So I should apologize if I don't have a very, very depthy understanding of something like the incel community. I've had periods in my life where I've been very lonely and things like that. So of course I relate to the basic kind of problem space. But I'm not celibate, and I don't think I've ever been truly involuntarily celibate, you know? So it's hard to relate, in fact, to that particular depth of pain. Like, it's hard for me to locate it in my personal. God, this is like ghostly, like ghoulish lighting. It's okay, we can hang with it, I guess. Should I put on the hood to be a better alchemist? Yeah, there we go. Now we're in an obviously like magical YouTube channel, right? Just need more strange drawings like everywhere on the wall. That was my ambition. Then I felt bad for my housemate. I want to like cover all the walls in insane drawings and leave like pinholes, like just completely like, you know, transform the entire room to like an inverse impression of Pinhead's head. Yeah, okay, that one didn't work out so well, but whatever. Right, I was saying that today in my journey through incel forums, both on Reddit and beyond Reddit, I went to both male and female incel communities and found just perfectly symmetrical statements, you know, in these two communities. Like, if you go to the incel communities and you look at the kinds of things they say about women, and you just sort of hold those in mind. And then you go over to the femcel communities, and you look at the kinds of things they say about men, you hold those in mind. Very often they're actually identical statements, and if they're not identical statements, they're like perfect jigsaw statements, you know, like the one community is saying women are like this and they're horrible in this way, and then the other community is saying men are like this and they're horrible in this way, and the ways in which they're horrible are obviously weirdly, horribly, codependently interrelated in some kind of, like, you can almost imagine the primordial fight or something in which all the bad feelings developed that then led to these terrible conclusions, which, by the way, are not all false conclusions. I do think it's quite true that men and women behave in oftentimes quite predictable ways that track instinctual things that are really the same in all people. And so many of the things these communities are observing about human sexual behavior are just completely correct, in my opinion. And I do think there's an awful lot of people who just kind of don't want to be associated with that in any way, you know? They're just like, do not reveal to us the fundamental awfulness and cruelty of, like, human sexual selection, you know? Yeah, it's fucking brutal. My physical appearance and other things about me, like my psychological state and things, have been like up and down in my life, you know? And so I've been on the side of receiving lots of adoration and kind of cheats in things in life because I'm you know, reasonably physically attractive and can be quite social and a little charming. I know how to turn that stuff on, you know? And even if I'm not turning it on in a way where I'm trying to I try not to do that, you know? I try not to manipulate people with glamour or whatever. But even without trying to do it, it just kind of still happens often. And so much of it is sorry, I keep trying to get to these, like, main points, but I keep getting diverted into these very interesting side topics. I guess that's just the nature of the beast with ideas like this. But since I'm going to invoke this sort of heavy example from incel communities to talk about this information war concept, and really it's a good example because, wow, these people are using information in just this bad way, and it really will make it clear, I think. But because I'm introducing all that, I think it's kind of a taboo topic, maybe, just a heavy topic. People don't really like to talk about incels unless the incels are the butt of the joke, or unless it's a very simple kind of condemnatory frame on the whole thing. And of course, that's just not my frame. It's never my frame. I'm not interested in condemning and judging people. I mean, I have the same interest in that as any other monkey, you know? We all have these primate instincts to do that kind of stuff, but it's not my, like, primary drive in the world. My drive is mainly understanding, and so when I go to these kinds of communities, I'm sitting with all the pain and the stuff that's going on there so that I can try to understand what's motivating it. And what's motivating it is a very true observation about a kind of de facto caste system that proceeds on the basis of people's physical appearance, especially the way their faces look. It just seems that human beings draw all kinds of complicated inferences about people on the basis of their facial features and other basic things about people. I mean, we all know about, you know, judging people on the basis of the color of their skin, or judging people on the basis of their gender, or things like this. Failing to see the individual and instead responding to a strange surface level of a kind of image-oriented level of people. And incels, because they are at the very bottom of that rung, or believe that they are, many of these people are not actually so physically unattractive. They have very bad self-image issues because many of these people were very badly abused in their childhoods, in fact, sexually abused by women and things like this. And so they've developed various sorts of psychological problems as a consequence of that, of course. But because there is a certain, and those people are maybe doomed or maybe not doomed, that would be contingent on the degree to which they could do their own psychological work and come to understand the ways in which they were abused, and find the forgiveness there ultimately. Very hard thing to do. And so many people aren't going to fail to do it. And so, open question there. But at least in that case, there's a possibility maybe. For people who are just genuinely hideous, and let's not kid ourselves, these people exist. I consider myself a pretty, I hate this, all these words, there's no words, like perceptive and empathic and open person, and a very soul-oriented person. There, I avoided using any of these terrible words. Like woke and these fucking terrible, stupid things. And even I have my standards, eh? It's just the case. Like there's a certain level of ugliness at which my physical attraction ends. And it's not just, the terrible thing about it, of course, is in a sense it's not superficial. It's instinctual. It's just a matter of, to put it bluntly, it's just a matter of like my dick is just not going to respond to a certain level of physical hideousness. And you can be the most beautiful person in the world. And I could see that. I could see the inner beauty and all of that. And I could maybe even fall in love in a soul way, but there's just no possibility of consummating it because there's no attraction. And, that's just operative at various levels and various degrees for all people. And it's just like a brutal law of numbers that, it's just like, okay, there's just going to be a distribution, and there's going to be some people that are really, really, really ugly. And because they're very ugly, people are going to make many, many assumptions about them. It doesn't just end with kind of people don't want to fuck you. That's terrible, actually. It really annoys and bothers me when I read these like think pieces about these communities that say things like, they just think they're entitled to sex. It's like, motherfucker, don't you? Who doesn't on some level feel like they're entitled to sex? Like, I think that the issue is sort of obviously like or feelings of entitlement to sex with particular people. That is a very bizarre aspect, I think, of the incel mindset. It's like, at a certain level, I think they're just so unhappy with their situation, of course, that they're just very resentful at the fact that standards even exist. But that's just the nature of, it's not even about standards, really. That kind of linearizes it so much. There is an aspect to that, of course. There is the whole point is that there is this ruthless linear line of physical, sort of basic, like formal attractiveness in the way that human faces look. It tracks things like symmetry and other very kind of low-level like things that our brains respond to at this weird like art-happy pattern level. So anyway, it doesn't end with just people don't want to have a relationship with you or whatever. It's also that people just make assumptions about you on the basis of how you look, like other kinds of weird assumptions. I'm not sure like about this, but I've just observed that like many stereotypes of this sort kind of cling together. If you're ugly, it's likely that you're also lazy and stupid. You probably smell bad. You probably, it's all this whole like weird, you know what I'm talking about here? I'm talking about like the kind of like neck beard, like if you take like a related kind of male stereotype, It's like maybe someone's just ugly and fat. Can we just leave it at them being ugly and fat? Why is it also like, all these other things? You're smelly and you're this and that. Like, it's just bullshit nonsense, People just carry around these bizarre assumptions that... It's actually a weird kind of dream logic, Because if you look at these caricatures, they just resemble archetypal material more and more, particularly as they evolve. They become less and less like anything you can relate back to a human being, and more just some bizarre symbolic fantasy of some strange character that then people use in a weird symbolic way to improve their own sense of sort of ego superiority over other people and so on. And so anyway, it's possible for me to look quite unattractive, I think. Particularly like periods of my life where I've had more weight on me, and when I've just cared less and kind of, dressed shabbily or things like this, like, I notice like people do less favors for me, and they're just much less friendly to me. I don't get smiles from people as much, Right now, I'm kind of the thinnest I've been probably in my adult life, and I'm now kind of dressing in a way that is more expressive of who I am, and I put some effort and work into that, Everybody smiles. People kind of assume that I have some kind of authority, or like there's some kind of weird respect that people send towards you when you look good, that you do not get when you don't look good. And I just, I've seen that. I've seen that in my own life, and it's bullshit. It's awful bullshit, and everyone participates in it silently, and no one wants to cop to it, And that's just a thing that'll drive you insane, by the way. So it's something I'd like to say if anyone from the incel community ever watches one of my videos. I would say, don't let culture gaslight you about your situation, You got a raw deal on the genetic lottery. And you're unlucky enough to be born into a space-time node that doesn't have any, that is very, very badly behaved in this regard. People have not done enough shadow work, fundamentally. They don't understand the ways in which they're petty and shallow, and so they want to virtue signal about it and pretend that they don't have these standards and pretend that, I don't know, or they want to just make a big joke out of it somehow, or pretend like it's about a sense of entitlement. It's not about entitlement. It's about the fact that human beings need sexual intimacy to feel positive in the world, And I'm sorry, but if you've never been in this situation, if you're not incel, how would you know? How would you know what it's like to have gone for, let's say, 30 or 40 years in some cases and never had a single sexual encounter with anyone, and to be staring down the rest of your life looking at a situation like that? Sex is pretty important to me. I can't even imagine, really. I can imagine a little bit, but the only way that I can imagine is by thinking through my dry spells. But that's just a normal part of being a human being in society. Everybody goes through periods like that, So there is no way to empathize directly with a situation about which you know nothing. You have to imagine the situation and find your empathy there, But that process is always a little flawed, in as much as you're trying to get to the bottom of what's objectively happening in the world, because you're involving imaginative processes. The projection can get involved as well, and it can become very difficult.
Phone storage died, so I decided to switch to the laptop, and now we can actually, if I get my pen tools up anyway, we can draw on screen. So I will lovingly reconstruct the image I had on my legal pad. Two people encountering an argument in a conversation. And now this is really kind of an imagined argument because we've tied this down to an example about incels and femcells. These two communities probably don't actually talk to one another very much, I would imagine. But I was saying that you'll find all these kind of interesting, symmetrical, and or kind of interlocking statement sets emerging out of these two communities that imply a giant argument going on. And the argument is basically a big war about who can project more of their terrible experiences with the opposite sex, or with, let's say, with kind of individual members of the opposite sex into, onto the opposite sex as a whole. So, situation kind of would look something like this. Somewhere in this cloud of ideas and associations and projective perceptions and so on are human beings that have very wounded hearts for various reasons. And as I was trying to articulate before, because the recording situation got interrupted, I don't know exactly what I was in the middle of articulating, but hopefully this is all going to make sense in the end. Because they are carrying around all of this pain and are in sort of so much pain that they can't really pretend that they're not. I think that's part of the thing that then gets them very outcast from culture, from society, which is often attempting to maintain a very particular sort of fantasy appearance of, I don't know, it just doesn't want to recognize the ways in which certain groups of people are truly, truly disenfranchised, So I think it just kind of, it has nothing to say to these people, really. I mean, it has no answer for them for a number of reasons. First of all, because culture as a whole, like it's sort of part of the mainstream cultural conversation, doesn't really understand this projection thing very well. The phrase exists in the pop cultural understanding. People will say, "Oh, you're projecting," and they're not being completely wrong in the way they use that term, but they're missing a lot of the nuance. For instance, I think the idea that a projection isn't always this, right? It isn't always this kind of negative thing, but that projection is really just a kind of channel of information. It's a way that your unconscious can deliver statements to you sort of through this projective layer. And there might be all kinds of interesting statements in there. Not all of them are going to be weird, horrible, negative things like this. I'm a person who believes that if you can learn how to zone out sufficiently in this projective process, that the unconscious will sort material for you in ways that often imply precognitive knowledge. It might show you things in the projective arena that track occurrences in the near or distant future, even. But you don't have to believe that to understand that there are all kinds of things you might know unconsciously that you might discover through a projective process like this. But anyway, my point was just that culture doesn't really have that kind of sophistication about it. So it doesn't really understand projection that well. So it doesn't know how to address the problem of these warring animi and animuses that are sort of taking place here. And it doesn't really want to understand the plight of these people, whether they're male or female or whatever the situation is, in terms of their financial status or whatever. Like, there are just various ways in which these people are marginalized and outcast. It's not purely about their physical appearance, probably. As I was saying before, a lot of these people have serious mental problems and so on. And culture just doesn't really want to hear that suffering and understand that it really doesn't want to admit that there's a certain inevitable degree of suffering that can come along with situations like this. It really wants to be able to offer up all these stupid sort of platitudes and say things like, just focus on, I don't know why. I don't even want to list them. There's all kinds of stupid things that people say very repetitively to these communities that aren't going to help them. These are things that culture and people who exist comfortably within the mainstream culture and so on, these are statements that those people and that culture itself in some way needs to tell itself in order to avoid having an empathic connection to these people, because they just don't want to interface or see or deal with with all that pain, I think, fundamentally. And so the point is just that these people are not going to receive really any help from culture. And in a way, that the whole point is that there isn't really any help for them. People who are really, truly stuck in a situation where they maybe have some kind of intense physical deformity or other things like this, it's very likely that they're going to be very lonely for much of their lives, And it's going to be a particular kind of loneliness, It's going to be the loneliness of ugliness. And that's so real and so brutal and so rampant in human society, and especially rampant maybe in the United States, which has become an increasingly image-focused country, interestingly. Of course, I have many particular beliefs and understandings about the nature of images. I think that in the end, image and instinct are not so shallow. It's actually something very magical and strange and depthy is going on there. But you see, that just creates sort of an additional level of ness about the whole situation for me, because then it's also okay, an aspect of this magic that, say, makes people fall in love with each other on the basis of, at some level, strange, formal, abstract properties about the way their faces work and their bodies work. It's what determines, and of course the way their psyches work and so on. It's what actually determines attraction between two people. Well, actually, people don't really seem to know very well. If you ask women what they think men find attractive in women, they'll give you a list of things that sort of track the actual male preferences. But very often, these kinds of statements tend to be more self-reflexive. These are just more indicative of things that people wish other people noticed and so on. And it's the same thing the other way around. If you ask men what they think women find attractive in men, it's probably even worse there. You get really insane answers that just don't have anything to do with actual female preferences, typically. And so that's just a kind of another area where there's just a lot of interesting sort of projective activity going on. In fact, I think... Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. There we go. In fact, I think that neither gender, and really just no individual people or institute, just whatever I'm trying to say here, nobody understands the actual nature of attraction very well at all. Because a whole lot of it is unconscious and instinctual and weird and strange and magical and biological and all the rest of it. And that's just the thing about it, is that it must be some kind of very depthy, layered thing that kind of descends into the animality and the instincts and all this carnal stuff. And because this is a very strange, natural thing, and because we know that nature is quite brutal, it's just the case. There's a very brutal aspect to this, because part of this whole sexual attraction business is about evolution, of course, which is a very, very brutal thing. Isn't it strange that there's a kind of an evolutionary something in the direction of kind of formal appeal of face structure? What's that about? It seems like that shouldn't matter. Somehow it seems to count for a lot. It's not just, like I was saying, sexual attraction. It's also, I think, so many things in your life are going to go better if you have a nice, beautiful, symmetrical face. It's about art, somehow. It's about art, and I wonder, though, because I think this problem could be much less terrible if people could learn to widen their aesthetic palettes a little bit, and to be able to see the beauty in the ugliness and so on. That's not going to address the basic plight of these people, that they have to be alone for their whole lives. That's terrible. But at least they could be a bit more visible if culture could learn to see them a little bit better. And of course, culture just wants to say, I don't have to learn to see these people. They're terrible, awful bigots. And yeah, that's true. Many of them have become that way. And But that's just to the point. I'm nervous about this whole situation, as it might intersect with certain other kind of information situations and so on going on. This is a big experiment, this whole internet, marginalized people finding themselves on the internet, which I was talking about in a previous video a little bit. That's been a very good and very healing thing for many people, but it also may have some slightly more negative consequences going forward, particularly as we're just learning to become comfortable with all this technology and how this stuff works, but that's probably for another video. Okay, finally, let's tie this down now to the information thing. Femcell is going to say, all men are this way, and they're going to list some statement that probably is going to have a little kernel of truth in it, but it's going to be like extraordinarily kind of exaggerated and like binarified, This only applies to men, and also all men are this way. It's going to be some kind of statement like that. And incel is going to say, oh yeah, well, all women are this way, and it's going to be just some identical kind of thing. And then femcell is going to say, yeah, well, I can back up mine with evidence. And then what they're going to do is they're going to go on the internet and they're going to search for some example that will prove what they said. And they will easily find such an example, because we now live in a situation on the internet where virtually anything you can imagine, it's whatever kind of insane situation. I don't know, here's someone holding a severed head while eating a banana, going down a water slide. You're going to be able to find some kind of weird headline or news article or situation or image or just something that's going to conform to that, because there's just so much information available. So this is more kind of like small information puddle thinking, that you can just sort of go out into this thing called the internet as if that's a puddle, and take your little measuring cup for information and fill it with one piece of information, and then come back and say, see, this proves my point. This one particular instance. And then incel is going to do exactly the same thing. They're going to say, yeah, well, I have evidence of mine as well. And they're going to go out onto the internet and they're going to find another strange particular example of something and fill their little cup with it. And they're going to bring that back and they're going to say, look what I found, Neither one seems to be cognizant of the fact that they pulled these little information creatures out of this huge ocean with like billions and billions and billions of such little creatures, and I'm sure that's, it's much more than billions of them. If we're actually talking about units of information, who knows what kind of astronomical Googleplex-ish kind of number we need to come up with there, And so these pieces of information, whatever they are, they've been ripped out of whatever their actual context is, and now they're just being used like little weapons in this stupid information fight that's going on. And so it's just people engaged in like hurt ego, like wars. It has nothing to do with actually trying to understand this information or understand any kind of actual information, like in terms of like, it exactly tracks what we were talking about with the alchemical stuff, right? It's like, okay, the internet's like this. It's like this huge, dense point cloud of stuff. And you can find any statement in there. And you can also just connect statements and find that there's so much access, so much information, that you can paint any kind of narrative you want out of this information. So you have to be really, really wary of people that come along and say, I've detected this big pattern. And you would say, okay, how have you detected this big pattern? And they're going to say, well, I've researched it extensively. And then if you press them, though, you'll find out they haven't really researched it extensively. They've just done they did an hour of Googling. And in that hour of Googling, they were being very, very selective about what they'll gather. They're just looking for things that conform to their original, attitude about some situation. So, that's true, but it's also true that big, dense information systems like this have objective structure as well. some things actually are real trends and patterns. And also there's such a thing as very subtle trends and patterns that might require some complicated statistical tools and so on in order to unlock, in order to see. So we have to hold both of those things in our consciousness simultaneously when thinking about big data. It is possible to manipulate big data for various purposes. So here's an example of a very common type of... Now in a way, I've done a very bad thing here, or I would describe it as a bad thing, which is that I've used incels and femcells as an example of something that actually everybody does. I've used them as an example simply because it's so obvious and extreme in their case. I haven't used it, I hope, to imply that they're worse about this than other groups. If you go look at, say, just any run-of-the-mill feminist group, you'll find exactly the same kind of information warfare taking place, particularly when they encounter their weird information opposite, like men's rights or MGTOW or that kind of stuff. If you watch fights between those groups, it's just exactly the same stuff, just as bad, just as... Well, and also I would say, like I said originally, I don't even know if this particular argument set takes place in real time. It just takes place kind of I've observed it mainly in a disjointed, quasi-offline kind of way, where it's just these separate communities talking to themselves about these other communities, not actual conversation. Something might actually be accomplished if there's an actual conversation, or maybe not. Maybe it would just be this terrible explosive sort of situation all over again. So it is possible to do that. It's possible to weaponize it in that way or just use it for some other particular purpose. But it's also possible to detect useful patterns in large sets that will give you real information about the world and about human beings. And so many of the things that these communities are noticing from their outsider perspective, and they're really outside, remember? Some of these people, there's just no possibility that they're going to have any intimacy with the opposite sex of the sort that they would desire. And again, it's not all the people in these communities, but there's a core group that for whom that's true. This is supposed to be an eyeball. It looks sort of like a tit, but let's see here. Can make it more eyeballish. Because these people are on the outside, there's a possibility that people could think any worse of them, So they have no problem sort of dumping exactly what they believe and think. And so that actually makes these forums that they post on and so on, very valuable sources of information for looking into the psychology of people who are very rejected and suffering in this way. People aren't looking at this stuff like that yet, I don't think, as a psychological resource. Because people are fucking dumb, I don't know. Or they're so blinded by the current historical situation. It seems so dangerous, and it is, and all of this, but people should look at this stuff more. You learn things about the human condition by looking at things like this. But I think that just at a very... Sorry, I don't know if I'm throwing away a topic a bit there, but I think just at the very basic level of this situation, it is fundamentally about understanding the way that selection bias works and things like that. The huge irony is that culture wants to tell you not to play around with this synchronicity stuff, It says that's very dangerous, and that's kind of soft thinking, or at worst, it might make you psychotic, or, And, well, there are aspects in which actually both of those statements are somewhat true, but it's precisely by playing around with this synchronicity stuff that you'll come to understand the thresholds of selection bias and things like that. You come to understand where that maybe ends as well. Because what you'll find is that, yeah, it is possible to... it's more than possible. You'll discover that you're doing this all the time. You're discarding information that you don't like and just letting it sink into your unconscious. And that's so omnipresent. And that's kind of one of the basic alchemical insights. It relates to the shadow work stuff. It's you've got to look at your own... You've got to look precisely at the things that make you unhappy and uncomfortable sometimes. Or they're going to probably fester in various ways, will remain unconscious, and then come back to destroy you in some way. That's just a very basic kind of insight about the way things work in the world we seem to find ourselves in, i.e. a world in which you have an animal in an environment. Many things are happening in the environment, some of which are negative and some of which are positive. And if you want to have an accurate understanding of your environment, inclusive of its potential for good things, the potential threats, and all, if you want to understand it in a holistic way, you have to look at the minuses as much as at the pluses. If every time you see a minus, you say, "Oh, I'd rather let's pretend that doesn't exist. Let's pretend that doesn't exist. Let's pretend that doesn't exist." Well, now you've made a world that's going to look very emotionally appealing to you, because you're going to say, "Wow!" And actually, at this point, you're probably going to start imagining pluses in places where there aren't any. I don't know why an anarchy symbol accidentally appeared there, but you're going to say, "Oh, Jesus, I'm surrounded by so many amazing positive things in my environment. I'm just in this beautiful garden of pluses." Well, you now have just a very bad model, like a kind of like half-blinded model of the world. And so your model doesn't allow for the fact that, oh gosh, there are snakes in my garden that could bite me. And so you're just much more likely to accidentally step on one and get bitten by one. Maybe if you'd paid a little bit more attention to the fact that scary snakes exist, you might have been a little bit more cautious when roaming around, say, certain areas of the environment that have a lot of snakes in them, but those are all minuses, so you wanted to pretend that there wasn't a big den of them over there, that kind of thing. And so that applies to the animal in its external environment, but it also applies to the animal in its primordial environment, which is its psychological environment. That's what you're in, always. You're actually not directly in an environment. That's an inference that we make. We think, okay, yeah, we're actually in an environment, because there seems to be this objective nature to it and all of this. And scientific method comes into play there and so on. But to start with, you're in a phenomenological situation. You're in your experience, first of all. So this is your experiential field here. And it's the same thing there. There are things in your experiential field that are going to make you a little unhappy sometimes. Just say at the level of you might have a thought or an insight or you might have a prejudice. You might have a really terrible kind of bias. You might have an instinct that bubbles up from somewhere deep and autonomic that might be very kind of, rude and unfortunate, and it might motivate you to say something or do something that might be very negative for another person and so on. There's all kinds of possibilities that can creep up on you psychologically. And the way to manage that is to be a good gardener. It's to look at the whole thing and try to be aware of the pitfalls, and understand the shortcomings, And so if you're not doing that, you're just setting yourself up for various kinds of disasters. And so instantly that relates to what we were talking about at the top of all this, just that when an animal finds itself in a situation where it can't determine what's a plus and a minus anymore, the whole fundamental sort of valuating system has been disrupted, and now they're just in this huge cloud of question marks. It's as if at that point the psyche can make can get into a state where it says, well, okay, the only thing that I already said all this, but maybe it'll click more with the drawing, right? The only way that I can improve my ability to map and understand this environment, because I have no idea what's coming now. I don't know what's plus or minus. I'm lost. So I don't know what I need. So what I need is just an increase in my awareness. And the only way to do that really is to begin with self-awareness. And so the work has to turn inward into a shamanic mode. And that's what the whole kind of active imagination process is, maybe. And it could be that you don't know how to turn inward in a direct way. So first, the internal situation is going to start filling this noise cloud in a projective way. And you're going to think you're looking at external structures, but really you're looking at internal psychological structures. And so I just see tons of people on the internet who are doing this very naively. They've dropped into this kind of thing. And I just think we need to develop some tools to help these people. And so, okay, I guess that's where I'm going to end this video here. I feel like I've been talking for a while, and that's a natural breaking point. I don't imagine that we're going to develop those tools tonight. This is going to require quite a bit of thinking, probably. But it just strikes me that there are many lessons about information that can be recovered from the synchronicity experience, and that are probably very timely and very useful. Because we're really entering into a new era here. People haven't taken this quite seriously enough yet, I think. We don't know how to take it. We don't understand yet the way in which this is really going to hit us. The information age, that's a deeper idea. So anyway, I'm not opening further can of worms. I'm closing this can of worms, and I will see you at some point in the future. Goodbye.